As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Don't leave until you hear our next speaker, who is Dr. Paul's former congressional chief of staff, 1978 to 1982, at which point he left to found the Ludwig von Mises Institute, currently in Auburn, Alabama. You know who he is. He is Llewellyn Rockwell. He joins us now.
Thank you. You know, sometimes people say that the American people are cynical about politics. Looking at the way the Bush administration has used and abused its power over the last 8 years, is it really surprising? You would have to be sedated not to be cynical. It should be clear why the Ron Paul movement took the country by storm. It represents something different, something hopeful. Sometimes commentators talk about how the Paulians allegedly have a dark view of American society. Of course, the opposite is true. The people worked so hard and donated so much to save this country from the regular politicians speaks very highly of their outlook. On the other hand, it's true that Paulians don't have a very high regard for existing political structures. Consider Bush. He has not only broken election promises and trampled on American liberties, he hasn't done a single decent thing for the country. And what he has done contradicts all the values he said he would uphold. Both times, he tricked people into voting for him. I wish I could report this wasn't his intention. And yet even from his first day in office, he spoke to aides about his priority of going to war on Iraq, a country hardly mentioned during his first presidential campaign. Here's another example. Just after Bush took office, David Frum, then a White House speechwriter, was part of a policy meeting with the new president. They were discussing the energy policy of the new administration. Now recall that in those days, gasoline cost less than $1 a gallon. Frum had the idea it would be a political victory to drive down the price. He suggested that Bush use the phrase cheap energy to describe his goal. Frum writes in his memoirs about what happened next. Bush, he said, quote, gave me a sharp, squinting look, as if he were trying to decide whether I was the very stupidest person he had heard from all day, unquote. He might have added that profits in the oil business, which is the business this government cares about, were growing thinner. Cheap energy, Bush answered, was how we got into this mess. What mess? Well, Bush explained to Frum that regular Americans were buying too many SUVs and pickup trucks, using too much gasoline, not paying enough for it. His answer was not to make energy cheaper, but to make it more expensive. Congratulations, Mr. President. Your wars, your regulations, your disruption of the international economy, and your failure to open up the industry to anyone except your cronies has resulted in a quadrupling of the price of gasoline.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Well, when people hear nullification, especially in today's environment, it means a lot of things, but usually it's portrayed as something negative. Why don't you tell me what nullification is?
Well, first of all, here's what it isn't. It's not jury nullification. That's a separate issue. You can have another conversation about that. This is state nullification. This is the idea that a state should not only refuse to enforce, but perhaps even actively thwart the enforcement of an unconstitutional law within their borders. So that's what it's all about. So you hear that, and you've been trained to think this must be evil, because we all know that smaller political units are evil and big centralized regimes are good. And the smaller units are always trying to exert their powers for disreputable purposes. And thankfully, according to the progressive version of history, we have these centralized regimes that come in and smack them down when they try to do this. Well, it's almost impossible to have a conversation when people have that background. And one of my favorite memories about all this, actually, Pete, comes from I was invited to speak at the Yale Political Union, where there's some controversial issue that you're going to come defend against all comers. And that means that students can come up and speak on behalf of what you've said or against what you've said. So I actually went to Yale and argued for the right of a state to secede from the Union. Now, that's different from nullification, but it follows the same kind of principle that the state has an existence of its own. It's not just an administrative unit of the central government. And it was so interesting to hear these elite students get up there and try to lecture me with like a third grade level lecture about racism and slavery, because they thought those magic words will just shut me up. And I just murdered them, Pete. But I murdered them with a smile on my face and jokes coming out of my mouth. And I charmed the whole room. And I ended up winning the point 2-1 in an audience of Yale students. I won the point 2-1 that state should have the right to secede.
So nullification, is it written into the Constitution? Where does the idea come from? Okay,
so it's not in the Constitution. But on the other hand, we should remember that pretty much almost nothing that we have the right to do is written in the Constitution. There's nothing saying you have the right to have a family. There's nothing that says you have the right to have, I was going to say a certain number of people at your funeral, but as we've seen, apparently you don't have that right. But the idea of the Constitution is that it lists the things the government can do. It doesn't list the things we can do, because that list would go on forever. The presumption is that you can do things. And so, whereas the government does not have that presumption. So the 10th Amendment more or less says that anything that's not mentioned in here, we presume rests with the states and the people. That's the arrangement. So nullification, in fact, is embedded in the very nature of the Union. That's more or less the argument. So Thomas Jefferson's view was spelled out nowhere better than in the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798 and the somewhat, maybe even slightly more radical Kentucky Resolutions of 1799. Now, those came out right around the time of the death of George Washington. So they were mostly overlooked because of that. But all the same, the gist of Jefferson's argument was, we have this federal government. These are all things we've all heard a million times, but just what's interesting is the conclusion Jefferson draws from it. We have this federal government with enumerated powers. It has only the powers delegated to it, and the 10th Amendment says that the states retain, and the people, everything else. But then Jefferson goes to the next point. Well, that's not self-enforcing. I mean, there aren't fangs that come out of the Constitution if the federal government goes beyond what it's allowed to do. So how do we keep this kind of equilibrium between the states and the federal government so that one doesn't swallow up the other? And the answer is there has to be enforcement teeth for the 10th Amendment. And that comes with the states. And why? Because they are the parties to the Constitution. The United States is not just one undifferentiated mass of individuals. It is made up of constituent parts. It's made up of individual societies, namely the states. And we know that because of the way it was ratified. It was not ratified in one single national vote of an, quote, American people. So what follows from this is that the states who created the Constitution, it's not right to say that the Constitution is a contract between the federal government and the states. That's not correct, because how could the federal government enter into a contract that created itself? It wasn't in existence at that point. So instead, the Constitution is a compact among the states creating a federal government. So Dr. Frankenstein, in principle, has authority over the Frankenstein monster because he's the creator. And likewise, the states have to have control over this federal government. Now, James Madison even said in the Virginia Report of 1800 that we can't assume that we have two fallible branches of the federal government and then one infallible one, namely the judiciary. That, oh, don't worry, the judiciary will solve this. If the federal government goes too far, don't worry, the courts will step in. But you know what? What if they don't? What if all three branches gang up on the public? I mean, we offer this to you, Pete, as a hypothetical situation. But what if all three branches gang up on the people? Then what do we do then? Well, then in the last resort, it's up to the creators of the Union to step in and say, we can't allow this because we never gave you the power to do it. Any other approach to this question assumes that the federal government has a monopoly on interpreting what its powers are. But we can obviously tell what would happen if it had such a monopoly. It will interpret every controversy in its own favor because there's nobody available to say no to it. So that's more or less the thinking behind it. Because if you read in your textbook, and these bastards have done this in basically every American textbook, it says Virginia and Kentucky failed to get any other state to side with them. Well, you know what? Let's look at that more closely. Why didn't they side with them? Because they wanted to throw you in jail for criticizing John Adams. Did you forget to put that in the textbook? Because that might make that side of the argument a little more dishonorable. So therefore, it's not even in there. Now, it doesn't surprise me. At this point, I'm so utterly unimpressed with American historians. It wouldn't surprise me if none of them even know that. If none of them even bothered to look at what the other states were saying. They were all cheering for this.
Going forward, when you look at this and with the trans insanity, how do you see this playing out? Do you see that nullification can be something, and what do you see as the likelihood in our lifetime that we're going to see a state just go, you know what, bye, we're done with this?
You know, it's funny, Pete, that calls to mind exactly what you just said a minute ago, that in January of 2020, we couldn't have predicted what we were going to be talking about in March of 2020, you know? And then secondly, I couldn't have predicted that the Bud Light boycott would have been successful because there are so many of these boycotts that just fizzle out. And that happened. I think there is backlash beneath the surface because it's not anybody famous involved in it. It's just regular people. There's a backlash against some of the craziness that's building. I saw a poll recently saying that, and I don't know what this term means to people, but that social conservatism was growing to like its highest level in, I don't know, 15 years. I forget what the thing was. And I think that's entirely in reaction to what there's, I don't think, these people are probably not all Bishop Fulton Sheen exactly, but they feel like what they're seeing today is just way too much.
Well, it's interesting. I was talking with my friend Jacob the other day, and he's saying, because he's younger, and he's seeing it in the Zoomers. It's the young people who are rebelling against this. And what's funny is when I look at like the people who follow me on Twitter, so many of them are really, really young. And that gives me hope. Now, of course, those are people in their 20s, and we're looking at people in their teens who are just falling absolute victim to this insanity, this new religion that the government has declared. But if the people in their 20s, if the ones that can get elected pretty soon to office are embracing social conservatism, at least that's something to hold on to.
Yeah, I mean, and again, even by social conservatism, if it just means they reject fact-free gender theory, I'll take that. We'll work on other issues later. I'll take that. And really, as long as it just means, I know, Pete, I get your thing about there's people who say mind your own business are always going to lose to people who just want to ram things down people's throats. But I think the people ramming the things down people's throats are starting to hit some resistance to that. And I think there are people who ordinarily wouldn't even want to be involved in anything like this. Like, I don't have time for this. This is stupid. Why am I wasting my time on this? But the answer is because I have no choice at this point. I think there is, at the very least, a growing number of people who do want to be left alone, but they don't mean that in some wimpy, non-judgmental way. It's, I specifically want to be left alone by you crazy people.
Of course, Bush's success in his energy policy comes at our expense. All of his successes have come at our expense. In fact, that last sentence might well be the theme of his entire presidency. Of course, he didn't campaign on the promise of making our lives more miserable. Let's take a look back and see what his slogans were. Do you remember the phrase, compassionate conservatism? He said in an early speech that the phrase came from an insight that broken lives can only be rebuilt by another caring, concerned human being. From this, he developed what he called a, quote, bold new approach. He would use government to care for us and to love us and to fix our broken lives. He alone would do this as head of state. Few knew at the time that this simple phrase, compassionate conservatism, masked a dangerous messianic ambition. Some wires had gotten crossed in his brain. He began to see himself as God's instrument on earth. Here was another phrase from early in his presidency. Bush was going to create, quote, an ownership society. Some commentators were stupid enough to believe that by this he meant he would privatize things and give control back to the people. To those who bought this line, I have only one thing to say: you got owned. Remember the phrase, humble foreign policy? Coming from Bush, that sounds about as ridiculous as the phrase, peaceful war, except he seems to believe in that too. His delirium is like an infection. It spreads. After all, Bush supporters are the people who continue, even to this day, to talk about their amazing tactical successes in Afghanistan and Iraq. Another former Bush speechwriter, Michael Gerson, in his new book calls Iraq a, quote, swift and humane success. If such claims do not qualify as Orwellian, I don't know the meaning of the term.
Very happy to have you here, and big congratulations to you. This is what I think journalism is for, and especially your style of journalism, too. Man, did you really get her done this time. And I know it's not the final say, but it's a big deal, so tell us about the case of Missouri versus Biden and Judge Terry Doughty.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very reluctant to say that this is a journalism-inspired thing, but in parallel to the Twitter file story that I worked on beginning at the end of last year with Barry Weiss and Michael Schellenberger and some other folks, there was a lawsuit that was developing that was instigated by a pair of attorneys general in Louisiana and Missouri, where they basically sued a whole range of actors in the federal government, accusing them of being involved in what they call a censorship enterprise. And the judge in the case yesterday, Terry Doughty, federal judge in Western District of Louisiana, handed down an order basically enjoining nearly all of the defendants, but a huge range of actors from agencies like the Global Engagement Center, DHS, the FBI, CISA, all kinds of people, from doing all the stuff basically that we describe in the Twitter files, reaching out to these companies, sending them content moderation requests, and holding over the threat of regulation and all kinds of other stuff. So it feels like basically a judge is putting a halt to all this stuff that people said wasn't even happening over the summer. So it was quite a ruling. It felt like a lot of validation for a lot of us.
Yeah, good. Well, look, I know you're very modest and don't like taking credit, but you deserve to gloat because, of course, you spearheaded this effort. And as you just mentioned, and as you mentioned in your writing, of course, there's this whole list of other journalists who helped you on this. But the Twitter files, well, go ahead and tell people who didn't hear about it. Can you kind of paint a little mosaic? I like the way you write about it in your recent piece at racket.news, Matt. You talk about how, well, at first we weren't exactly sure what we're looking at. The more and more files they're giving us, it's kind of painting this picture of, wow, all these agencies, what exactly are they doing? And it begins to really come clear to you. So make it clear to us what it is we're talking about.
Sure. So at the end of November and early December of last year, I got invited to go to Twitter and look through the files of the old company. And apart from the first story, which was kind of jointly agreed upon, we decided to look at the episode involving the Hunter Biden expose and the suppression of it by Twitter, the one that the New York Post wrote. After that, it was just a whole bunch of us looking at sort of a gigantic pile of emails and Slack chats and other stuff, and we had to make sense of what we were looking at. And in the course of doing that, we ended up with this basic plot where we thought what we were seeing was Twitter did not want to be involved in a mass censorship exercise, but they were dealing with pressure from the Senate Intelligence Committee and some other folks that suggested that they would be regulated if they didn't go along. And before long, they instituted this very sophisticated system by which they were getting requests to take action on thousands of accounts by groups all across the government. I mean, it went through the FBI and the DHS for the most part, but it was like a huge range of agencies that were sending these spreadsheets full of requests. And as you say, a lot of us we were looking at this and thinking, we can't report this because nobody's going to believe it. It's too weird. But as it turned out, the people who were investigating this lawsuit basically found the same thing, and they came to their conclusions through a completely different means. And so that felt pretty good. I mean, I think what we were looking at was a very sophisticated, kind of nascent cross-government censorship scheme that, if nobody had intervened, would have become kind of like a Ministry of Truth type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Have all these, all the evil Mr. Burnses in the government rubbing their hands together and saying, oh, here's what we'll do. We'll just, have cutout companies do all this work for us. We'll get Stanford University somehow to take the lead, and all of these groups. I think you guys did this thing of like the dirty 50 of these things. There's an endless list of these NGOs and university groups and whatever. But then the idea is the government can get away with violating the Bill of Rights because it's not them doing it. It's these private organizations. And as you even describe them, they're sending requests. And so even if they're threatening Twitter, that's a nice headquarters you have there, be ashamed if it burnt down kind of thing, at the same time, they're still just asking nicely. And so is that the same thing as violating Congress shall make no law? And so then, did I characterize that sort of right? And then what does the judge say about that, Matt Taibbi?
Well, he's pretty negative about it. I mean, he goes through a long list of citations of cases talking about the government is basically barred from what they call significant encouragement. Like there's one case, the Lee versus the Macon County Board of Education. I'll just read one of the lines from it. It's axiomatic that a state may not induce, encourage, or promote private persons to accomplish what it is constitutionally forbidden to accomplish. So in other words, we can't get somebody else to do it just because we can't do it. It's the same argument, oddly enough, that, came up in the Alan Dershowitz reversal of fortune case. Like, you can't get private investigators to break into a house to do a search just because you can't get a search warrant. Like, it doesn't work that way. And the judge looked at this entire scheme and basically concluded clearly this is not innocent communication. This is an organized scheme where, for instance, you have the FBI agent talking about how we succeed with 50% of our requests and that sort of thing. The use of cutouts and the fact that they had disclaimers like, oh, at your sole discretion, you may decide that this is a violation of your terms of service. That's not good enough. I mean, I think that was one of the things that we found with the Twitter files. Is we published this stuff. We didn't even have to say it was a violation of the First Amendment. Ordinary people looked at it and they said, we don't like that. We think that sucks. And now here's a judge saying, well, you think that for a reason because it's illegal. And there's obviously going to be a fight about it, but I agree with him.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole reason for having a Bill of Rights is because they're going to get carried away and they got to come up against a brick wall somewhere. And the best invention we got so far is black robe judges who can't be fired for overruling these people. That's basically it. You know, right. Our last stand.
Right. And here's another thing that drives me crazy about this, which is you see the mainstream media reaction to this ruling. You saw the reaction to the Twitter files reporting and to this lawsuit. All throughout, they've been behaving as though this reporting or the lawsuit or whatever, that we're the radicals who are, creating some kind of new wild standard of, permissibility and impinging upon normal government behavior. No, what they're doing is completely radical. And I would say ordinary American sort of ACLU liberals, even 10 years ago, would have thought this sort of vast system of organized, preemptive interference in the speech landscape, they would have considered that absolutely insane not that long ago. And now, it's just normal. I mean, again, you go back to a case like Brandenburg v. Ohio or something like that, where they set the standard for, when do we stop incitement? They set that bar incredibly high, and here it's so low. Like they were getting involved with everything for no reason at all. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So now, if you could please talk more about the true content, where I'm interested, I guess, especially in the examples of vaccine injuries and these other things, where they explicitly say in their messages, I guess the government messages or the NGO messages to Twitter, that, look, this stuff is true, but we do not like the anticipated effect that it will have in the public conversation. That's why we want you to delete it. But factually true claims, specific claims that people are making that they admit are true, how much of that is going on in there?
How much? I mean, enough that they had to give a name for it in a department. I mean, they had a subcommittee at the Department of Homeland Security called the MDM subcommittee, which is misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Uh-huh. Malinformation is just true information that is narratively inconvenient or produces an outcome that they think is adverse. So, for instance, in this case, there were emails that were produced where a White House official was expressing, frustration to Facebook that they weren't doing enough to remove bad information from search procedures. And Facebook responds by saying, don't worry, we're already reducing the virality of, quote, often true content that might produce vaccine hesitancy. And this shows a couple of things. Number one, it shows that Facebook views the government as something that has to report to. Right, like the whole tenor of these communications is sort of master canine, right? Like the platforms are constantly sort of reporting on what they're doing and asking if that's enough. But the second thing is they're saying, yeah, we'll take down even the true stuff, even the stuff that doesn't violate our policies. We'll de-amplify it if it makes you happy, because they're trying to produce a certain narrative outcome. And this is constant, a thing that's like a through line in the whole narrative about digital censorship, which is that they're looking at narrative as opposed to fact. Fact is increasingly irrelevant to these folks. What they're interested in is the political reaction of the readers, and that's what's dangerous. Mm-hmm.
Many people say the Bush administration has departed from conservative principles. There was a time when I might have said that too, if by conservatism we mean the constitutionalism of Robert Taft and Ron Paul. But consider that Ron is the only Republican in the whole Congress, or anywhere inside the Beltway, to stand up to Bush's attempts to create a totalitarian state. Only Ron Paul has consistently opposed Bush's wars, regulations, spying, and shredding of the Constitution. Ron Paul alone has warned against Bush's monetary policies, his trade policies, his diplomatic misadventures, and his crazed, megalomaniacal arrogance. Many Republicans might say they've opposed this administration privately. You might say the same thing about the Stalin, the Hitler, and the Mao administration. Those who can speak out against wickedness and do not do so are morally culpable. What does this tell us? It tells us that conservatism, as we once knew it, is hopelessly corrupted. You can detect it at cocktail parties, where self-identified conservatives sneer at the very idea of liberty. Clearly, in the age of Bush, conservatism now constitutes as great or an even greater threat to American liberty than the left and left liberalism. It is long past time for every right-thinking American to reject the term conservative as a self-description. I, for one, no longer believe that Bush has betrayed conservatives. In fact, he has fulfilled conservatism and completed the redefinition of that term that began so many decades ago with Bill Buckley and National Review. Think of it realistically. What does conservatism stand for today? It stands for war. It stands for power. It stands for spying, jailing without trial, torture, counterfeiting without limit, and lying from morning to night. There comes a time in the life of every believer in freedom when he must declare without any hesitation to have no attachment to the idea of conservatism. After immigrating to the U.S., Ludwig von Mises was aghast to find himself described as a conservative. He denounced the term in 1956. F.A. Hayek in 1960 announced very clearly that he was not a conservative. Murray Rothbard wrote thousands of words of protest. Yeah, Murray. Yeah. Murray Rothbard wrote thousands of words of protest against the term. Frank Chodorow went further. He said that anyone, Frank Chodorow, who called him a conservative would get a punch in the nose. Now, the leaders of the Republican Party, meeting not far from here, are telling us that the only real alternative to the socialism of the Democrats is the fascism of the Republicans. They don't call it that, of course, but that's the traditional name for this combination of nationalism, militarism, and right-wing collectivism.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
Reuters. U.S. Chapter 11 bankruptcy filings jumped 68% in the first half of 2023. Blow me the fuck away. Never would have known it. Thanks to the COVID war. But nobody talks about that. And again, we do. You ready? Office building bust, the first to call it, going back to when the scumbag pricks, mostly pricks, locked down the fucking country. And I can't say the other word. This is gone, man. And that's going to be the banking bust. Your office building bust. We've been writing about it for 3 years. Now it's making the news, but hardly in the hard sense, because here's some of the headlines. Commercial sector turmoil, Royals ground leases talk. In the first quarter of 2023, investors purchased only $489 million of Manhattan office properties, compared to $5 billion in the first quarter of 2022, according to MSCI Real Assets. Why the fuck would you buy them in 2022? How fucking stupid could you be? I'll tell you why, because you don't subscribe to the Trends Journal and you're just a member of the shithouse club. What else? The average acre of land, you ready for this? In Manhattan sold for $67.7 million so far this year. $67.7 million. There's no inflation. What a fucking joke. But you ready? Down nearly 60% from the same period last year. Remote work persists, not just for white-collar jobs. Wall Street Journal. Yep. Office building bust. Chief financial officers weigh the various issues of return to the office. So far, 51% of U.S. companies are opting for some kind of hybrid work arrangement, according to a report covering more than 4,000 companies by the software company Scoop. The share of people in the office under so-called structured hybrid work arrangements, which requires workers in the office a set number of days, increased to 30% in the second quarter of this year. Ready for more? Office market remote work woes spread. Many businesses that depended on sectors are having to pivot, shrink, or worse, like go out of business. We warned this would happen. The banking crisis has just begun. In the whole commercial real estate sector, there's over $20 trillion in debt. And again, as the interest rates go up, a lot of these loans cost more. And you have less tenants and you can't pay it. The brunt of the impact so far has been mostly felt by office landlords and their lenders. No shit. Buried down at the bottom. Their lenders? Why don't you say the fucking banks? And it's mostly small and medium-sized banks. But don't worry. Hey, Jamie Dimon will get bigger, you know. They'll go JP Morgan Chase and all the others. They'll buy up everybody with our money. Don't worry about it. Oh, and what else? As well as small businesses that depend on commuters. Blow me the fuck away. Never would have known this. We forecast this more than 3 years ago, March 2020. It's in your Trends Journal. And it's in this week's Trends Journal. All the posts that we put are the forecasts that we made in the articles. We tell you what in the world is going on, what it means, what's next. The only magazine that gives you in-depth trends analysis and trend forecasts. We give you history before it happens. Cluster bombs. It's nothing more than a clusterfuck. That's all it is. And what's a clusterfuck? According to Merriam-Webster, an utterly disordered and mismanaged situation. A muddled mess. A muddled mess brought to you by the fucking murderous people that are running our government. As the fucking economy is going down, as people are living paycheck to paycheck, bloodying the killing fields from a guy that loved every fucking war. And look at this little fucking shithead scumbag up your ass, Lindsey Graham. A little fucking warmongering fat slob. One little fucking freak after another with your masks on. Remember that? Oh, there's Lloyd Austin. Oh, what was he? Oh, I know what he was. He was formerly sitting on the board of directors of Raytheon, the second largest defense contractor before becoming America's Secretary of State. Yep. So here's the story. White House transfers cluster bombs to Ukraine. U.S. President Joe Biden has green-lighted a supply of cluster munitions to Ukraine as part of the Pentagon's 42nd arms package to Kyiv. Quote, this is that other little piece of arrogant shit. He looks like George Goebbels' grandson, that Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. I'm a National Security Advisor. He said U.S. officials recognize that cluster munitions create a risk to civilian harm from unexploded ordnance. This is why we deterred the decision for as long as we could. But now he goes that he's arguing that much of an addition of civilian harm Russia has caused. That's why we're sending them. So cluster bombs are banned by more than 120 countries. The Red Cross said today their use must be condemned. Fuck you. Fuck off. We don't care. We're murderers and thieves. By our deeds, you shall know us. We are America. What's your favorite war? Well, I grew up during the Vietnam War. Hey, how about the 2 Iraq wars? Well, I like the Afghan war. How about the Yemen war? We won't talk about that. Nobody does. I want that guy Gaddafi out of there. I want Assad out of there. Oh, yeah. Oh, those dirty Russians. Yep. This is an article that was a headline in Yahoo. Kremlin poll shows half of Russians back Wagner's mutiny. That was the Wagner mutiny 2 weeks ago. And now the poll's showing that half. You read the entire article. It was published this Monday. Not one word about the poll. Instead, we see Putin's reaction. It's weak. Who said that? Oh, Zelensky told the Cartoon News Network. Zelensky claimed that half of Russia supported the Wagner boss. Oh, but it says a Kremlin poll. But only believes Zelensky, he can play the piano with his penis. And go to YouTube, type in Zelensky playing piano with his penis. There you are. Not making this up. This is the people that America, bring them to Congress, hang up their flag, bow down to them, do anything we want him to do. He's in charge. Yep. Oh, look at Camilla. Oh, how lovely. Yeah. Oh, look at these clown shows. How fucking stupid can you be to swallow the shit from these lowlives? That's all. Stand up. Look, it's a disgrace. A fucking disgrace. Nancy Pelosi, Kamala Harris, all the fucking clowns. Look at them there. Look at them. West Bank camp. They're occupied land. They use the word occupied. It's colonized. It's stolen. But I'm reading this to you because I want to show you the propaganda. Those dirty Russians, but Israel could do any fucking thing they want. Tensions remained high after the Israeli military and Gaza militants exchanged fire earlier in the day. Gaza militants. Israel goes into Gaza. According to the article here, 12 Palestinians and at least 5 children were killed during the operation. Oh, but wait a minute. Zelensky vows revenge for Kyiv attack. The Russian missile killed 4 people. That's a headline in Financial Times and all the media. Yeah, they killed 4 people. But it's okay for Israel to go in to a land of another country, kill 5 kids, wounded 140, including 30 in serious condition, and killed 12 already. But they're militants. It keeps going on. Emerged as a stronghold of Palestinian militancy in the West Bank. Palestinian area, Israel went into raids to break up suspected militants. You're a fucking militant if another country comes into your country and you fight them back. This is total propaganda. To show you how fucked up things are, they got this picture over there. These are the clowns running us. This guy that's playing king over there, Charles, in the UK. Look at this little fucking clown show. Look at these guys dressed up in their fucking drag. They're all better than us. We're just little pieces of shit. We come from royalty. We come from a crime syndicate that killed more people than anybody, and we've taken control, and we're worth more money than anybody anywhere. Look at this fucking clown with his little fucking drag shit on. Little fucking medals. Look at this. And then there's this other guy, Dutch King. Dutch King apologizes for Netherlands' role in slavery. Why? I thought only the United States was slavery. All these fucking bastards were. Dutch King Wilhelm Alexander apologized for his country's role in slavery. He referred back, as he told the crowd of invited guests and onlookers. Invited guests and onlookers. Quote, "Today I stand before you. Today as your king. I make this apology myself. As your king, here, king. Here, boy. Come here, king. Sit. Give me a paw. Lay down. King? What's this fucking king shit? It comes from a line of fucking murderers. King. A line of murderers. And they're still playing fucking king. And that's all it's about. Freedom and democracy, fuck off. We're in control. Nearly half of tap water in U.S. contains forever chemicals. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. We let the big companies fucking poison us everywhere we go, anytime we want. Again, we got a lot more. And don't forget to get your t-shirt. Hey, politicians, who the fuck are you?
The Republican leaders have a heritage, and it dates from the interwar period in Europe, when certain politicians took power amidst economic crisis. Having their confreres in power in our time represents the gravest danger facing our country. Of course, Ron Paul has been campaigning for liberty and against the socialist and fascist dangers since he first read Hayek and Mises in medical school, since he first encountered in immoral wars severed limbs and crippled souls as a flight surgeon in the Air Force, since he first decided on August 15, 1971, to dedicate his life as a public intellectual and a public official to free markets and sound money against Nixonian economic controls and the unlimited money creation by the Federal Reserve that has brought us so many booms and busts and to this current crisis. Indeed, since Ron Paul tells us he was born a libertarian, we can say he's been fighting for freedom his entire life. To do so, Ron Paul has had to buck Republican conservatism. But look at the peerless, shining example he set. Look at what he has done. Look at this historic event and dream of what he will achieve in the future with our help. To those who have lingering attachments to conservatism, I will close with the words that Murray Rothbard addressed to the Young Americans for Freedom in 1960. Quote, "Why don't you get out? Breathe the clean air of freedom, and then take your stand proudly and squarely, not with the despotism of the power elite and the government of the United States, but with a rising movement in opposition to that government. Then you will be libertarians indeed, in act as well as in theory. What hangover, what remnant of devotion to the monster state holds you back? Come join us. Come realize that to break once and for all with statism is to break once and for all with the Buckleyite right wing. We stand ready to welcome you," unquote. Well, today Ron Paul stands ready to welcome you. The thousands of us in this hall say to the millions who yearn to breathe free, join us, join Ron Paul. Thank you.